Today we're going to get some much needed clarity on the often misunderstood religious divide in the Muslim world and cover topics often left out of standard Western reporting. I'll start with Sunni Shiite Islamic divide and how this ancient split has shaped the current U.S. Islamic conflict with Iran, global diplomacy, and terrorism.
Terrorize this.
You might have wondered, why is Iran an Islamic nation so isolated in the Muslim world? Why do most Arab countries condemn its actions? And why do Iran's allies, like Hamas and the Houthis, receive little support from the broader Islamic community? Additionally, I'll introduce you to lesser-known modern prophecies, implications to the biblical revelation, and talk about some of the broader geopolitical aspects to what's going on right now in the Middle East. Stick around because this episode is going to be relevant for the next decade.
It is such a big explosion, it can smash in buildings and knock signboards over and break windows all over town. But if you duck and cover like Bert, you will be much safer.
The divide between Sunni and Shiite Muslims goes back to the death of Muhammad in 632 AD. And of course, that world had competing views on who should lead the Muslim community going forward. Sunni Muslims, the majority, believed leadership should go to the qualified individual chosen by consensus. Abu Bakr, Muhammad's closest companion, was selected as the first caliph. Shiite Muslims, who make up about 10 to 15% globally, believed leadership should stay within Muhammad's family and backed Ali, his cousin and son-in-law, as the rightful successor. The disagreement was both political and spiritual, and it's never healed. Today, around 90% of Muslims are Sunni. Shiites are a minority concentrated mostly in Iran, parts of Iraq, Lebanon, Bahrain, and Yemen. This difference created two distinct branches of Islam, each with its own religious traditions, legal schools, prayer rituals, and historical narratives. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution turned Iran into the world's first modern Shiite theocracy, led by a supreme leader from the Shiite clerical class. This government fuses political and religion in a distinctly Shiite framework, promoting the concepts of the guardianship of the Islamic jurist as the basis for rule. Shiite Islam, particularly 12-verse Shiism, is the dominant sect in Iran, and it emphasizes the martyrdom of imams, especially Hussein, whose death at Karbala remains central to Shiite identity. This gave Iran a unique and ambitious religious vision to export its vision of Islamic revolution, not just politically, but theologically. This had also come about as Democrat President Jimmy Carter solidified and expanded U.S. involvement in the Middle East. Iran became hostile to the West following the overthrow of the U.S. allied Shah and the hostage-enforced takeover of the U.S. embassy in Iran. Carter's response was to freeze Iranian assets, impose economic sanctions. He also launched a failed rescue mission called Operation Eagle Claw. Diplomatic ties were then severed, which have never restored. Today, 40 years later, Iran's religious distinction is deeply embedded in its identity and foreign policy. Iran sees itself as the guardian of Shiite Islam and often positions itself against the Sunni majority world, including Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, and even fellow Shiites who don't align politically. To advance its religious and political goals, Iran supports a web of Shiite-aligned militant groups across the Middle East. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, Shiite militants in Iraq and Syria, and controversially even Hamas, a Sunni group in Gaza due to their shared opposition to Israel. Iran has funded, trained, and armed these groups, not just for regional influence, but to establish what some have called a Shiite crescent from Tehran to the Mediterranean. These groups often serve Iran's goals of exporting its revolutionary Shiite ideology and undermining Sunni-led governments and their Western allies. And it's this that gets at the heart of why other Islamic nations don't rally behind Iran. Despite a shared Islamic identity, most Sunni nations reject Iran's religious leadership and oppose its militant proxies. The reasons are both religious and sectarian. Sunni leaders view Iran's Shiite ideology as heretical, and Iran's claim to religious authority threatens the legitimacy of Sunni scholars and governments. Also, groups like Hamas, while Sunni in doctrine, take Iranian funding, causing distrust among other Arab governments, such as in the case of Jordan in the 1970s, where Palestinian refugees from Gaza sought to overthrow the government, and also the Palestinian support for Iraq's conquest in Kuwait and overthrow of that government, which saw the US kick off the Gulf War. Even further, Iran's interference in places like Syria, where it backs the Alawite Shiite regime of Bashar al-Assad, directly conflicts with Sunni majority public opinion in the region. Iran's support for Shiite militants in Iraq and Syria and the civilian toll of those conflicts fuels Sunni distrust. In Yemen, the Houthis, Shiite rebels backed by Iran, are fighting the Sunni-led Yemeni government backed by Saudi Arabia. Iran and Saudi Arabia are rivals for regional dominance, both religious and geopolitical. And finally, although Hamas is Sunni, its alignment with Iran has alienated other Sunni states. Egypt and Jordan, both Sunni, have called out Hamas for dragging Palestinians into Iranian-driven conflicts rather than pursuing peace. In another vein, many Sunni scholars and leaders accuse Iran of using religion as a cover for geopolitical expansion, destabilizing Muslim-majority nations, and fueling proxy wars in already volatile regions. This has led to isolation. Iran is often viewed as a pariah state, not just by the West, but by its fellow Muslims. However, it shouldn't be assumed that the Shiite branch of Islam is the chief aggressor in global unrest. As a reminder, it was Sunni Muslims who carried out the Armenian and Assyrian genocide, where nearly 2 million Armenian and Assyrian Christians living in Turkey under the Ottoman Empire were slaughtered or starved to death near before and after World War I. It's also worth noting that the plane hijackers who carried out the 9/11 attacks on the U.S. World Trade Center towers were mostly from the Sunni nation of Saudi Arabia, and no retaliation or accountability has ever been carried out for that action. But Americans are still forced to suffer with federally imposed TSA agents every time they travel. Where is the justice? I have to ask. Today, the Arab world, especially Sunni nations like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, are increasingly trying to balance support for Palestinian rights with resistance to Iranian interference. The Abraham Accords, established by President Trump in his first term, have normalized relations between Israel and several Sunni Arab nations, something said to be impossible by former presidents including Barack Obama. Since then, Sunni leaders have denounced Iran's proxy wars, especially the Houthi attacks on shipping trade in the Red Sea. This is why even when Gaza erupts, Iran's closest ally, Hamas, often finds itself with few friends in the Arab League. So in the end, what began as a religious disagreement 14 centuries ago continues to shape the alliances, rivalries, and conflicts of the modern Middle East. Then again, Iran is also widely known as a state sponsor of terrorism due to its funding and training of groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and Houthis, and Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria, as well as its regional ambitions to spread its Shiite Islamist ideology, along with its hostility towards U.S. allies, especially Israel and Saudi Arabia. Despite crippling U.S. and European sanctions, Iran has maintained its influence, and one reason is its growing partnership with Russia and China. Russia and Iran share a military strategic alliance, particularly in Syria, where both support the Assad regime against U.S.-backed rebels and Islamic groups. Also in arms deals, Iran provides drones used in Ukraine, and Russia provides air defense systems and tech. Against the West, both nations see NATO and U.S. presence in the Middle East as threats to their regional ambitions, which I say, if your ambition involves genocide and regional instability, you get what you earn: stupid games and stupid prizes. Iran's asymmetric warfare tactics involving proxy militias, cyber operations, and sanctions evasion are lessons and tools that Russia now actively use, especially under Western sanctions following their invasion of Ukraine. This is not the first time the rest of the world has learned something from Islam. For example, Italian mobsters originating in Sicily took a beat from 200 years of Islamic rule, which is how they mastered the art of extortion for their protection. Today, China is Iran's largest oil consumer, often buying illicit or discounted oil despite U.S. sanctions. In return, China secures a reliable energy supply insulated from Western pressure and leverage in the Middle East without direct military involvement. China's massive energy demand means Iran, sanctioned and desperate, offers a cheap, politically allied supplier. Iran has increasingly turned to cryptocurrency mining and transactions to bypass sanctions. This is why Israel's recent cyber attack, which crippled Iran's crypto-funded banks, was so significant. Its national grid supports large-scale Bitcoin mining, some of which is exported or traded in back channels with Chinese entities. China, although regulating crypto, has tolerated underground crypto financial pathways with Iran, particularly through Chinese intermediaries and shell companies. This allows both sides to dodge SWIFT-based tracking, funnel resources to militant proxies, and avoid U.S. financial surveillance. In 2021, Iran and China signed a 25-year cooperation deal, reportedly worth over $400 billion, covering energy infrastructure, military cooperation, and telecommunication, including Huawei expansion. In return, China gains regional influence and economic access. Iran gains political cover, as well as tech investment. Why this matters to global security? Well, Iran's support for militant and terrorist groups is not only regional. Its Revolutionary Guard and other forces have been tied to assassination plots in both Europe and the United States, as well as weapons smuggling in Africa and Latin America, and cyber attacks on infrastructure around the world. These operations are funded by oil revenue, crypto, and Chinese trade, and often enabled by Russian weapons and tactics. But that's not all, and it should be more surprising, but often obfuscated by Western media, that the U.S. has actively funded these global terrorist operations in various ways. The most obvious way is by direct funding. Democrat President Barack Obama sent over $1 billion in U.S. dollars on a pallet to the Iranian government. This aid has been scrutinized as being used for weapons development in the country, including for Iran's nuclear program and for funding terrorist groups that threaten Israel. Additionally, Democrat President Joe Biden also authorized the release of $6 billion in held funds to Iran. On top of that, Biden also relaxed sanctions on the country, allowing over $100 billion in capital to be recouped by the actively genocidal regime, allowing them to fund the October 7th attack on Israel, where approximately 1,200 citizens were gunned down in cold blood, and over 250 were taken as hostages, many of whom would die in confinement under inhuman conditions, rape, torture, and starvation. The funds have also been used to bolster Iran's current military arsenals, including rockets and missiles, which have since been used to attack U.S. military installations. Additional funding has gone towards other terrorist operations in Yemen, where Houthi militants attacked the U.S. Abraham Lincoln in an ongoing attempt to block trade routes. China may not publicly endorse terrorism, but it avoids condemning Iran's militant activities, protects Iran diplomatically at the UN, and provides the economic means for Iran to stay afloat: oil purchases, tech access, and long-term trade agreements. This is part of China's broader strategy to challenge U.S. hegemony, promote a multipolar world order, and build alliances with rogue states willing to resist Western norms. Iran, China, and Russia are not natural allies, but they are convenient partners in resisting Western sanctions and influence, all the while each engages in human rights atrocities. China among its own people and abroad, influencing elections in other countries, manipulating trade routes, taking advantage of other nations and their natural resources, and arming Mexican cartels and sending fentanyl into the United States. Russia among its own citizens by sending hundreds of thousands into a pointless battle and killing off its generation of youthful men, while ignoring the economic needs of its people. And Iran by continuing to keep its citizens oppressed and manipulated by state-run media, propaganda at home and abroad, and working to destabilize the prosperity and security of innocent human beings across many countries, denominations, and continents. These nations are economically and militarily intertwined, united only by a desire to undermine the current global order using both conventional and unconventional means, including proxy wars, digital currency, and information warfare. Iran may be a pariah to much of the Islamic world, but to Russia and China, it is little more than a chess piece in the broader battle against Western values, including individual autonomy and freedom. And in recent history, spiritual implications have surfaced to bring a further understanding to what's happening and what might come of it. In Eastern Orthodox Christian tradition, especially among Greek, Russian, and Serbian elders, there are prophecies concerning a greater war in the Middle East, involving Israel and its neighbors. The destruction of Iran's military power as a trigger to broader global conflict, and a global reshuffling of empires before the return of Christ. Elder Paisios of Mount Athos, from 1924 to 1994, canonized in 2015, prophesied that the spark will start in the Middle East. The Jews will attack Iran. Then the Russians will descend, and things will spiral into global war. The Third World War envisioned by Orthodox seers includes a sudden Israeli preemptive strike against Israel's nuclear facilities, Russia, historically Gog or Magog in Orthodox interpretations, intervening, a chain reaction pulling NATO, Turkey, and China. These prophecies are not official dogma, but they're taken seriously in many monastic and traditionalist Orthodox circles. Israel has repeatedly warned that it will not allow Iran to develop nuclear weapons. Iran's nuclear sites are hardened, underground, and closely guarded. At least they were until the US lent a hand in bunker busting those locations just the other day. The Israeli strike was preemptive, surgical, in response to the decades of hostility and proxy warfare Iran has used against its people. The understanding is that retaliation could trigger Iranian retaliation through Hezbollah, Hamas, or Houthi rebels, but these are largely suppressed by Israeli and US intervention already, though it might invite Russia and China diplomatic military countermeasures, and could expand into a regional or global war, possibly aligning with Orthodox end times expectations. Though there are other current world problems in Europe that could also lend to the buildup of civil unrest and eventual warring within those nations, and escalate into broader conflict. What about the LDS prophecy on global war, civil collapse, and the Second Coming? While not canonized scripture, several visions and teachings from LDS leaders in the 19th and early 20th centuries describe future global conflict. These include John Taylor's vision, who was the third president of the church, saw foreign troops invading the U.S., widespread destruction and bloodshed, the U.S. government in ruins, cities burning, and saints fleeing to Zion in the Rocky Mountains. Joseph Smith's White Horse prophecy, recorded secondhand, allegedly predicted the Constitution will hang by a thread, and the elders of Israel will step forward to save it. The U.S. will also be attacked by foreign powers, including China and Russia. LDS scholars and commentators such as W. Cleon Skousen foretell a second U.S. Civil War, possibly beginning in Chicago or other major urban areas, a global economic collapse with the U.S. dollar losing its value, the rise of authoritarian states like China invading the U.S., and war coinciding with the second coming of Christ. Of course, current geopolitical realities lend parallels to both Orthodox and LDS traditions. Israel has openly carried out strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. Russia is already in a hot war with Ukraine and aligned with Iran and China. China increasingly threatens Taiwan and has warned the U.S. about regional involvement, and additionally made many incursions into the U.S. and its political, economic, and social affairs, most recently by the FBI in the 2020 election. U.S. political polarization and civil unrest, especially in cities like Chicago, continue to deepen, especially since the influx of thousands of illegal immigrants into the city, causing cultural divisions and the exhaustion of community resources unable to support the population spike. This is very reminiscent of the importation of Venezuelan refugees into Los Angeles, California, following the riots of 1989. This led to cultural rivalries and civil instability among already established racial communities in LA, which sparked the creation of the infamous MS-13 gang. And finally, the US debt crisis and inflation are weakening confidence in the dollar, with spending power substantially decreased since the Obama administration and continuing to fall, though this has been an ongoing issue since at least the 1960s. It sped up significantly under the Obama administration, who engaged in the largest amount of government spending our nation has ever seen. Orthodox prophecy sees Israel's strikes on Iran as the trigger for global war, while LDS visions see this event as a small part fitting into a broader collapse that leads to the Second Coming. And at this point, it's worth covering the symbolism contained within the Arab nations and their connection to biblical prophecy as well. The colors of pan-Arab flags, red, white, black, and green, have a curious and symbolic connection to the four horsemen of the apocalypse described in the book of Revelation. While the biblical text is not explicitly about modern flags, some theologians, as well as biblical prophecy commentators and observers, draw symbolic parallels between John's revelation and modern geopolitical realities, particularly the tensions between Israel and Iran and the broader unrest in the Middle East. The four horsemen of the apocalypse are described in Revelations 6:1-8. Where each seal opened by the Lamb unleashes a rider on a colored horse, representing a force of judgment upon the earth. The white horse is conquest and deception. Its rider has a bow and a crown, seen as symbolic of false peace or deceptive leadership. Some believe this represents the Antichrist-type rulers or religious deception. The red horse is war. Its rider granted power to take peace from the earth, symbolizes bloodshed, civil unrest, and regional or global warfare, often linked to ideologies or governments driven to violence. The black horse represents famine or economic collapse and carries a scale or balance linked to commerce. It indicates global scarcity, inflation, or collapse of financial systems. The pale horse is a rider named Death, and the Greek word for pale in this case is chloros, meaning greenish or sickly green, representing plague, biological warfare, or mass death. Several interpreters, especially in prophecy circles, draw a symbolic parallel between the colors of the horsemen and the flags of Arab nations, particularly in light of ongoing Middle East conflicts. Countries with full green, white, black, and red flags include Jordan, Palestine, Syria, Iraq, Sudan, the UAE, and Kuwait. Of course, the book of Revelation is largely focused on the final unfolding of evils on the world, including global deception, war and judgment, economic collapse, cosmic signs and plagues, a final battle in the Middle East, often linked to Armageddon, ending with the second coming of Jesus Christ. Many Christians interpret current events as birth pains or foreshadowings of Revelation's judgments. The key end-time alignments are as follows. Israel is seen as God's prophetic timepiece, Ezekiel 38 and Revelations 11. Iran, or Persia, appears in Ezekiel 38 as part of the Gog and Magog coalition attacking Israel. Russia, Iran, and Islamic nations are thought to align against Israel in a future invasion. China is seen in Revelations 9 and 16 as part of the Kings of the East, a massive military force entering the final conflict. And global economic collapse, the black horse, plague, or biological weapons, green horse, are already conceivable threats today and ones we've seen in recent times, perhaps a preamble for what's to come. The colors of the Arab flags aren't inherently prophetic, but they visually and symbolically echo the four horsemen of Revelation in a way that many believers today interpret as spiritually significant. With Israel and Iran playing at war, and the world already grappling with economic turmoil, plagues, and geopolitical instability, the book of Revelation feels less like a mystery and more like a manifesto of coming reality. And of course, let's not forget Matthew 24:33. When you see all these things, know that it is near, right at the door. My conclusion is this. Whether taken as divine prophecy or symbolic warnings, both Orthodox and LDS traditions see the modern age as the threshold of greater upheaval, beginning in the Middle East involving the rise of Eastern powers and culminating in divine intervention. And at the center of it all, a volatile triangle between Israel, Iran, and the world powers as religious, political, and spiritual threads converge, If you're interested in some light reading, I recommend my book, The Saints Who Built America, How Sacred Foundations Shaped 200 Years of U.S. History. And with that, I'll leave these thoughts with you. I've been Pastor Theology, and this has been all about your faith.